Welcome to the Baptist broadcast. Thank you all for tuning in. What would a year be like if we didn't have any conversation or debate going on about natural theology, Thomas Aquinas, Van Til, the Reformers, the Post-Reformed, and what they thought about natural theology, presuppositional apologetics versus classical apologetics? What would a year be like if we didn't have those things to talk about? I don't know. We've been through all last year was COVID laden, yet there was still some room for some of this dialogue to persist. And this year is most certainly no exception, especially with the much anticipated book, The Failure of Natural Theology, written by Dr. Jeffrey Johnson of Grace Bible Theological Seminary. That book is currently being promoted by Dr. Owen, who has recently moved from Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary out to Grace Bible Theological Seminary. And so we're all very much looking forward to that book. However, there have been some very strong claims precede its release, which will be September 23rd. I believe it's about 264 pages or 263 pages, so it's pretty accessible. But the claims that have preceded it, the kind of verbiage that has been so far attached to it would make you think that it's going to be a 5-volume refutation of the Summa Theologiae. But that's, of course, not the case, and that's not the purpose of the book. However, there are some claims going around, I think, by Dr. Owen Strahan, Dr. Jeff Johnson, even himself, that would make the work seem to appear much more robust than it's going to be. I don't think we can hope for anything nearly as effective as they think it's going to be in 263 pages. That's just, if you're experienced at all in terms of reading books, that are even slightly polemical, you will understand that not much gets done in 263 pages. You could engage perhaps one loci of the thought of Thomas Aquinas or something like that, or of natural theology, one aspect or two of it within that space. But it seems like what's happening with this book is that it's going to tackle the problems with natural theology, and there seems to be a generality to that goal as it's stated by both Johnson and Strahan that just make me think that it's probably not going to do what it's setting out to do. Although I'm still hoping for the best. I do hope that it does bring something new to the table. Ink has been spilled time and time again over the last 20th and into the the 19th, 20th, really the 19th, really the 20th century is the worst time for Thomism. It's the worst time for natural theology. It came under fire by Francis Schaeffer. It came under fire by Cornelius Van Til, Gordon Clark, Rojas Rushdoony, and so on and so forth. So it's come under fire time and time again, especially in the 20th century. So the 20th century has really been the worst time for it, and a lot of ink's been spilled. I have on my bookshelf here almost the entire collected works of Van Til, not bought as a collection, just literally piecemeal put together as I read them. I would buy them, and so I have nearly everything that he's written, not quite everything, in hardback form, but also more online, Kindle, and formats like that. So there's been a lot of ink spilled on this issue, and a lot of ink spilled by way of attempted refutation of both natural theology in general and particular versions of natural theology. Usually what you see in someone like Thomas Aquinas, there have, in Van Til's case, even been attempted refutations of what has been seen in post-Reformation theology, with the Puritan rekindling of a natural theology and an articulation of the proofs and so on and so forth. The purpose of my video here is really just to, I'm anticipating Jeffrey Johnson's book. I'm hopeful for it, and I'm looking forward to it. I will either request a review copy from Free Grace Press, or I will buy one if I'm not able to do that, and I will do a review that way. But in anticipation of that book and in anticipation of all of the discussion that it's hopefully going to elicit, I wanted to come on here and maybe do some clarifying work to some comments that have already been made. Examples of those comments would be seen in like Owen Strahan's most recent, one of his recent posts on his page, and I interacted with this post earlier today, and I did so charitably, reaffirmed my love for both him and Dr. Johnson. I respect both men greatly, and I especially appreciate that Owen Strahan has moved out of the SBC, and the fact that Dr. Johnson has given him a home, rightfully so, at Grace Bible Theological Seminary is great. And so it's been a very positive development for them personally, I think, and as an institution for GBTS to bring Dr. Strahan on board. I respect both these men. I sat under Dr. Strahan's teaching. He was one of my professors for Theology 1 at the master's level. And so I came to respect him during that time. We didn't agree on everything, and that's fine. But nevertheless, I had a respect for him, and I still have a respect for him. I was concerned, however, the fact that I commented on his post. He responded because I commented a link to an article that I wrote that preempted a book review. It was a preliminary. It was not a book review by any means. It didn't even announce itself to be a book review. You can go on my website, joshsummary.org, and see it. Yet he had basically alleged that it was a book review and seemed a little annoyed that I would even take to writing anything about this book, because all the information, after all, that we have on it is contained in the description. Notwithstanding the fact that Jeffrey Johnson has done an interview with Iron Sharpens Iron, and there's plenty of his thought out there that is going to, I'm sure, be regurgitated in this book. Nevertheless, I was at least mildly accused of jumping the gun. And then I responded. I said, the article admits those restrictions or those limitations, and does by no means venture to set itself forth as a book review. And then my comment was deleted. So I don't know what happened there. But here I'm making a video to clarify my thought more clearly on this and kind of respond in a way to something that Owen Strahan said in that post that I had commented on. He says at the beginning, the Reformers, Puritans, Edwardsians, and Baptists all rejected the syncretistic philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. Now, the first question I want to ask when he's making this kind of a comment underneath a post about the failure of natural theology, I want to ask if he's talking about the syncretistic philosophy of Thomas Aquinas in genera, or if he's talking about the syncretistic philosophy of Thomas Aquinas in terms of his natural theology that you see in the very first pages of Summa Theologiae Volume 1. And then he says he was a Roman Catholic, and the Reformation was nothing other than a thoroughgoing repudiation of much of the theology Aquinas helped to develop. I agree with that, but then again, you're making that kind of a comment underneath a book that's about, apparently, if we can just judge it by the title at all, and then the description, which is relatively lengthy for a book description, it's a book about natural theology. Right? So are you talking about natural theology, or are you talking about Thomas's thought in general? Are you talking about Thomas's view of merit, which certainly was rejected by the Reformers? Are you talking about his doctrine of the Eucharist, which certainly was rejected by the Reformers? Are you talking about his the idea of meritorious grace, which again falls under that broader category of merit, certainly rejected by the Reformers? Are you talking about his conflation of justification and sanctification? Again, certainly refuted by the Reformers. Are you talking about his Mariology, his view of the saints, praying to them, etc.? Again, refuted, rejected by the Reformers. Okay, so I agree with all of that. So what's being talked about here, I took it to be the very first parts, the prolegomena, if you will, of his Summa Theologiae, which takes place in Volume 1, and the earliest questions of Volume 1. Now, what a lot of people do is when they begin examining Thomas, they go straight to the 5 proofs, or they go straight to his question, the heading on the existence of God, and then his questions which follow that heading, and they examine his theology in light of the fact that those 5 proofs are there, and then everything else follows thereafter. But one of the things I wanted to do in this video is I actually wanted to, if I can tinker with this view here, is I wanted to look and see what Thomas himself says before he even gets to his existence of God in the earliest pages or parts of his Summa, because I think what Thomas says is very important. And if you don't understand, if you start too late in the game, you're not going to get the context of Thomas's further thought or more expansive thought on the matters that you are bringing into question. So one of the things that I wanted to look at in this particular video was the words of Thomas himself. And the words of Thomas, I mean the words of Thomas before he even gets to his topic on the existence of God. We're going to look at what he has to say about Revelation. And then I want to look at some things that Stephen Charnock, the Puritan, has to say, and also some things that Dr. John Owen has to say as well. Both of them are Puritans, okay? And so I want to get all this out on the table for my listeners so that when this book comes out, you're able to have some tools, some background knowledge of the horse's mouth, so to speak, and what these guys actually believe. Because I fear that what happens most of the time is people drop into Thomas, and then they read his 5 proofs or the 5 ways, and then they think that, because everything else afterwards, all of the rest of his theology comes after that he's formulating his theology purely on the basis of those proofs, which is not the case at all. You can't get to that kind of a conclusion when you read Thomas even-handedly. And then to say that the Reformers, and especially the post-Reformed, jettisoned out this aspect of Thomas's theology, namely natural theology, is just patently false. Now, of course, the post-Reformed, the Puritans, make some very important qualifiers to natural theology that would disagree with some things that Thomas says, and it would actually disagree with a lot of what Roman Catholicism ended up canonizing from Thomas's thought. But they don't reject natural theology altogether, and they appropriate a lot of what Thomas says into their own literature. Okay, so let's begin by looking at what Thomas himself says, and I'm just going to hopefully pull up the window here. Don't know if that's going to be possible, actually. Let's see. Okay, I don't see Amazon on there. I wanted to pull up the... Nope, that's not going to... Oh, here we go. Good deal. All right. This is what I wanted. So can I make this? Yes, I can. All right. So what we have here is we have the first article, and then question 1, Article 1, the Summa Theologiae, Volume 1. What's the first question that Thomas asks? Whether, besides philosophy, any further doctrine is required. And then there are a couple of objections that he anticipates. And the first one is, it seems that besides philosophical science, knowledge, we have no need of any further knowledge. All right? And this would be what the pagans would say. This would be what the Greeks would say, that philosophy really is the end of all knowledge. And so for that reason, we don't need anything else. And then the objection says, for man should not seek to know what is above reason, but whatever is not above reason is fully treated of in philosophical science. Therefore, any other knowledge besides philosophical science is superfluous. Objection 2, further knowledge can be concerned only with being, So metaphysics. For nothing can be known save what is true, and all that is true. But everything that is treated of in philosophical science, even God himself, so that there is a part of philosophy called theology, or the divine science, as Aristotle has proved. That's natural theology. Therefore, besides philosophical science, there is no need of any further knowledge. So what the pagan is saying, or what the objector here is saying is, look, we have everything we need in philosophy, and one branch of philosophy, or one category of philosophy, is theology, which we would say is natural theology. So look, we have everything. We're fully equipped with philosophy. All right, that would be the objection. Thomas says, on the contrary, it is written, and he cites Scripture, 2 Timothy 3:16, all Scripture is inspired of God, and by the way, I'll highlight this. All Scripture is inspired of God, is profitable to teach, to reprove, to correct, to instruct in justice. Now, Scripture inspired of God, he says, is no part of philosophical science. So it's not natural theology, which has been built up by human reason. Okay, so in Thomas's mind, philosophy, as distinguished from supernatural revelation, is built up by human reason. But he says, therefore, it is useful that besides philosophical science, there should be other knowledge inspired of God. Now, that's kind of his abstract of what he's going to continue on in terms of his rebuttal to these objections. He says, I answer that it was necessary for man's salvation that there should be a knowledge revealed by God besides philosophical science, besides natural revelation, in addition to natural theology built up by human reason, he says. Firstly, indeed, because man is directed to God as to an end that surpasses the grasp of his reason. The eye hath not seen, O God, besides thee, what things thou hast prepared for them that wait for thee. Isaiah 66:4. But the end must first be known by men who are to direct their thoughts and actions to the end. Hence it was necessary for the salvation of man that certain truths which exceed human reason should be made known to him by divine revelation. Even as regards those truths about God which human reason could have discovered, it was necessary that man should be taught by a divine revelation, because the truth about God, such as reason could discover, would only be known by a few, and that after a long time, and with the admixture of many errors. And that's exactly what the Reformers, that's exactly what the post-Reformed said man does to natural revelation in their natural theology. They receive the revelation of God. It's in here, so it's to that extent it's natural theology, it's natural science, natural wisdom or knowledge, and they immediately pervert it in their sin, according to their sin nature, which you have there is an admixture of many errors. That's how Thomas articulates it, whereas man's whole salvation, which is in God, depends upon the knowledge of this truth. Therefore, in order that the salvation of men might be brought about more fitly and more surely, it was necessary that they should be taught divine truths by divine revelation. It was therefore necessary that besides philosophical science built up by reason, there should be a sacred science learned through revelation. So natural revelation is not enough. The natural theology derived from natural revelation is not enough. There must be special revelation or supernatural revelation, and there must be a supernatural or special science, which we call supernatural theology, okay, in contrast to natural theology. And then he responds to the objections in particular. He asks the question is in the second article whether sacred doctrine is a science. Then he asks in the third article whether sacred doctrine is one science, whether sacred doctrine is a practical science, whether this doctrine is the same as wisdom. These are all good questions to ask, by the way. I'm not going to go through all of them. Whether God is the object of the science, of course he is. Whether sacred doctrine is a matter of argument. Should we argue about it, defend it? Can we defend it? Whether Holy Scripture should use metaphors. So now he starts to talk about Scripture and the language of Scripture. Let's see, whether Holy Scripture, whether in Holy Scripture a word may have several senses, this whole idea of the quadratic interpretive method of the medievals, some of which is kept on into the Reformation and the post-Reformation. And then he gets to question 2, the existence of God. So already he started with Scripture. But if you talk to a critic of Thomas, you would think that he started with pure unaided reason. And that's just not what he does. He begins his theology with the affirmation that what is contained in the Holy Scriptures is absolutely necessary and is really the principal, most useful theology that man could come by is what's revealed in the Holy Scriptures. And what you find in the let me get this off of here because we don't need it anymore. Please look further into that yourselves. Read that yourselves. You can go look at it yourself. This is a Kindle version of the Summa, but I have a hard copy as well. If y'all want pictures, if y'all want screenshots, let me know. Citations or whatever. Let me know. I'll be happy to provide them. Now, what Charnock and what Owen do is not much different in terms of what they state about natural theology. In fact, Charnock has strong words for those who deny a natural theology. He lumps them in with the Socinians, which were heretics. And what he says, now I don't have Charnock digitally, so I'm not going to be able to bring him up on the screen, but this is the first volume of his Existence and Attributes of God. And it's on, let's see, page 28 of the, the Baker edition, the 2-volume set, which was printed in 1979. But for those of you who don't have this edition, this comes to us in Discourse 1 on the existence of God. So you can find it in there. But what he says is I've spoken the more of this place because the Socinians use this to decry any natural knowledge of God, any natural theology. And that the existence of God is only to be known by revelation. That's what he's saying the Socinians believe. So that by that reason, anyone that lived without the Scripture hath no ground to believe the being of a God. The Scripture ascribes a knowledge of God to all nations in the world. And he quotes, or he cites Romans 1:19, not only a faculty of knowing, if they had arguments and demonstrations, as an ignorant man in any art hath a faculty to know, but it describes an actual knowledge manifest in them. This is not natural. When we talk about natural revelation and natural theology, natural revelation is not just something that's kept outside of the mind of the depraved sinner. It gets in, right? It gets in to some extent. This is why it says in Romans 1. So if you go with me to Romans 1, a lot of people will say when they get to Romans 1 and you look at verses 18 through 20, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth and unrighteousness because so they'll take verse 18 and they'll say, well, look, they pervert the truth that's around them. It doesn't really get in here. They don't have a knowledge of it. But that's contrary to what verse 19 says. Because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. And then it goes on. The claim actually gets stronger from the Apostle Paul. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. That word is perceived, discerned clearly. And again, that's said of the reprobate or those who are outside of Christ. Being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. And then in verse 21, because although they knew, okay, so these people had a natural theology. They have a natural theology. The natural revelation is getting in. They know the true God. It says as much in verse 21. Because although they knew God, they what? They did not glorify him as God. Right? Okay, so Charnock affirms a natural theology. Now you have to read him more expansively and more comprehensively to see exactly what he thought about natural theology, but he does run through the proofs. He demonstrates the existence of God in the earliest pages of his Existence and Attributes of God. Owen does something similar, but he says in chapter 6 of his biblical theology, he treats natural theology extensively at the beginning of his biblical theology, which is great because Owen actually lays forth a good, solid, reformed understanding of natural theology, and he qualifies it as much as is necessary, I think. He talks about natural theology before the fall. He talks about natural theology after the fall. He talks about what pagans do to this natural theology or with this natural theology after the fall. But in chapter 6, he says, as that awareness of God, okay, again, it's a knowledge of God which has prevailed and still continues among sinners who do not have the benefit of supernatural revelation, is of the kind and is built upon those evidences which I have described. We can now proceed to consider whether or not those who eagerly follow natural theology may ever attain theology's ultimate goal and the natural become a true theology. So Owen, right, and of course he goes on to deny that it can. Those who follow natural theology, again, if they do not have Christ, they pervert it. If they do not have that further revelation that Thomas talks about in the earliest pages of his Summa, then they are not helped. Then their natural theology is of no use to them. Okay? So what you have in Charnock and Owen is a basic agreement. I'm not saying an entire agreement or a perfect agreement with Thomas, because that's certainly not the case. But you have a basic agreement on the general issue or topic or locus of natural theology. All right? And you also have a basic agreement among all three of those men that natural theology is not enough, but that there must be, and also in that vein, that natural revelation is not enough, but that there must be a supernatural revelation and a supernatural theology added to it and corrective of it even. And I will just say before I jump off here, when I talk often about natural revelation and natural theology, and I make that distinction, the distinction needs to be there. Reason being, because natural revelation describes for us what is, okay? That's the actual content, right? And natural revelation exists regardless of whether I know it or what I think of it. It exists objectively in the out there. It exists as it is, as God has set it forth according to his will, regardless of what I think about it. Okay, so that's natural revelation. Natural theology describes the process of getting natural revelation in here, all right? Turning the revelation, as it were, or examining the revelation as a science or as something that should be and can be known by the observer, okay? So those two things are distinct. They're not totally separated and divorced from one another. Natural theology is the ratiocination or the study of natural revelation, okay? But natural revelation remains what it is regardless of how I pervert it, regardless of whether I know it or not. It just is there, okay? It doesn't depend on what I think about it. It's objective, right? It's mind independent. But when we're talking about getting that natural revelation in here and apprehending it and knowing it, that's natural theology, all right? And that's how it's always been understood across the board. That's why Owen says, he describes it in terms of an awareness of God. That's an epistemic, awareness is an epistemological category, not an ontological category. Man is aware of the ontology of natural revelation, and that is his natural theology. And it's either good theology or bad theology, and what Owen's saying is that it's going to be a bad theology, because these are sinners, and they're going to corrupt the theology. They're going to corrupt the natural revelation once they get it in here, and they're going to form it into some kind of an idol or use it as license for their sin or whatever if they remain estranged from the supernatural revelation and if they remain blind to it. Charnock says the same thing. Thomas says the same thing. There's basic agreement here between these three authors. I think that is enough. I'm already at 30 minutes and that conversation went by quickly. So anyway, God bless you guys. I hope this was helpful. If it was, give me a thumbs up. If not, give me a thumbs down. Let me know why. Comment below. Don't forget to click the subscribe button and the bell next to it for notifications. Again, have a wonderful evening.